Hey, everybody. Thanks for coming back to join us. We're the Menschwarmers, your bi-weekly look at the world of Jews and sports.
Happy Purim, everybody!
Happy Purim. As we're recording this, I believe it's day 2 of 3 of a weird 3-day Purim, if you live in the right place.
I think Purim is as long as you make it. Purim is definitely a state of mind in my household.
Well, we talked about this last year, that like Purim is the candidate for the breakout Jewish holiday. And I think this year I felt like there was a lot more discussion online in the, Jewish and like sort of the borderline Jewish, non-Jewish spaces about Purim and Purim related things. Like 5 years ago, no Gentile would know what a Hamantashen is, but now maybe they would have heard of it or have had one.
Yeah, well, I put this on Twitter the other day for those who are following us on social media, and it seemed to get a pretty good response that there's been a lot of Hamantashen hate around the internet this year. And I, a big creator of and eater of Hamantashen, I made about 2 dozen, and my wife, she is 8.5 months pregnant, but she ate, I think, all of them between then and now.
I think your take was
delicious.
I think your take was right. All Hamantashen are good. I mean, they're all fine. They're I think a high floor, low ceiling cookie. The best Hamantashen I've ever had was not transcendent, but even the worst one is like perfectly fine with a cup of tea and to close out a meal.
It's shortbread and jam, right? If you were to have everything that made a Hamantashen, even a bad Hamantashen, but it was like, 2 dry pieces of shortbread with a little marmalade in the middle of it, because we all know the marmalade Hamantashen are the worst ones. Then let's imagine that as a cookie. You could be having it in any coffee shop anywhere in the UK as if it was like a standard thing. Yeah,
I think, again, at worst, it's still a decent cookie, shortbread and jam or some sweet filling. What's your favorite?
I'm a raspberry jam guy. I usually make my own raspberry jam. This year I got lazy. 1 year, our producer Michael and I made poppy seed filling by itself, and I think whoever is living in that apartment now is still cleaning it off the stove.
That sounds like a recipe for disaster. I don't know how they get the poppy seed. Poppy seed is my favorite. I don't know how they get the poppy seed so delicious, But
I think it's just sugar and heat.
I think it's just sugar and heat. Yeah.
How do they get the poppy into the seed?
The poppy seed is just a vessel for what is essentially caramel.
Yes, I think it's more or less poppy seed flavored caramel. And I was actually talking this with some non-Jewish friends. Why do we eat the hat? Like, I know Haman's bad. I missed the part where we decided that eating his hat is the right move.
Got to eat something. I know the poppy seeds, like, at least in retrospect, the analogy is that they represent the fleas in Haman's pockets. And that's very silly. Why would you eat the fleas? It's all just, rhetorical. I think the Hamantashen, some people say I think that they're supposed to represent his ears, but I think the tri-corner hat is like a feature of Haman, right?
Yeah, I think it's both. That hat. How many people have famously worn the tri-corner? Maybe it's a Paul Revere thing after the American Revolution. We decided that it was hat related.
Maybe.
But it's also interesting. I learned about Purim, which I think is a good tie-in to what our podcast is about. It's not actually a religious Jewish holiday, but a cultural Jewish holiday, not unlike the start of spring training or when Max Homa wins a PGA Tour event.
Good segue to, I think, our first sports topic of the pod, a little update for the PGA season that's early in its
PGA Tour. Year. It should be called the PJUZE Tour.
That's right. So for the first time ever, I looked this up. I did some deep research on the Wikipedia. 2 Jews won PGA Tour events in back-to-back weeks.
Did Corey Pavin never win two events in a row?
No, I mean, most golfers haven't, even pretty good golfers haven't won 2 events in a row, right? Like,
it's rare.
It's rare. Like, and often you take a week off if you win, like if you're someone who's really good. But yeah, so Daniel Berger won the AT&T Pebble Beach Pro-Am at Pebble Beach, obviously.
And then he took the next week off, allowing some room for
Max Homa, who won the
Hyundai Genesis Open.
The Hyundai Genesis Open, yes. At Ventura? No,
Riviera.
Sorry, what's it called? Riviera.
Home course of Lawrence David.
Right. And Max Homa, a Los Angeles kid, I think he spoke afterwards about how emotional it was to get the trophy from Tiger Woods. It's Tiger's tournament. Tiger, obviously, a few days later, very tragically suffered a significant injury. But, Max Homa was very emotional and very effusive about it. So great to see both those guys win. We spoke about this on our last pod, was taped during the AT&T Pebble Beach
during Daniel
Pro-Am.
Berger's magical good vibe run to the top.
Yeah, and we said, he's the guy to watch. I mean, he's going to be in the top 10 soon if he isn't already, or after this weekend. He's going to be a guy to watch at all the majors this year,
including the Ryder Cup.
Big contender. And I think the same thing can be said of Homa. Max Homa is having a great season so far. He had a top 10 finish at Pebble Beach. He's had a few other top 20 finishes this year, and he won a tournament, at his home course. And I think the momentum is with him going into the Masters, which are, just 6 weeks away now, right?
About 6 weeks. My child is actually due on Masters Sunday. So
wow.
Should Max Homa or Daniel Berger be in the finals, I have to ask our producer, are we allowed to write off my hospital stay?
That would be nice. You know how you get to write off your hospital stay? This is Canada. You don't have to pay for it.
No, we're
most
going
expensive
to the
thing
upgrade, to the individual room.
Well, if you both get semi-private coverage, then you can combine that to one private coverage.
We do. Actually, my insurance will pay for all of it, but that's not important.
The most expensive thing about giving birth in Toronto was paying for parking at Mount Sinai Hospital.
And if I recall, you were quite pissed off.
Well, it was like $40. That's a lot for parking. I mean, sure, everything else was free, but still, it's a principle of the matter. And you can't. It's not like you can park 6 blocks away in some cheap spot that you know about when your wife is in labor. And going through contractions.
Like 8 hours long. But it's true. You're right.
That's like a second. You know what? It was the first baby. Maybe the second baby. It's like, no, honey, look, I know a spot on Baldwin. Like, it's a bit of a schlep, but we're gonna save $20 here. This guy will let me park overnight. Like, you'll be okay, right? You're not gonna give birth for another 5 minutes. All right,
I'm just gonna pop into the ramen place. Like, well, go ahead. I'll catch up with some food.
Yeah.
But if I think we're James, if the baby is coming and Max Homa is making his way through Amen Corner, Homa and Berger are in the final group together on hole 12 coming in, and my wife is in labor, I'm going to have you solo that coverage.
Do you know what you should name your baby if it's born on Master Sunday? Augusta.
Ooh.
That's an intense name. Ooh. That's like born for greatness.
Intense.
Yeah.
Has any Jewish person been named after a place that has explicitly banned Jews before?
That's a good question. I'm sure there must be it must be someone.
All of the Leibowitz children running around Toronto are named Granite Club Stein and Granite Club Cohen.
Some pretty inside baseball on formerly restricted Toronto clubs. Rosedale Gerberwitz or something like that.
Right, exactly. I think if I name the kid Augusta Cohen, Hootie Johnson will turn over in his grave.
I think, Hootie Johnson gets a bad rap because he was the chairman during that time when they were dealing with whether or not to include women members at Augusta. But I think he was actually like a really good guy. Like, I think he was like very involved with charities and like a concerned environmentalist or something like that. In terms of, and just speaking of people being named after places Jews aren't welcome, our producer Michael has reminded us of the great composer Irving Berlin. That's a pretty good one.
That is absolutely true. Irving Berlin. I'm sure there is like a Racklaw Shulowitz who was a violin player somewhere.
So moving on from our little golf update, we have an update from the Australian Open, and I got to say mea culpa on this one, or whatever the Jewish slicha, I guess.
Mea culpa. I hardly know a culpa.
During our last pod,
Slicha. Do we start Slicha Corner?
Slicha Corner is good, actually. We'll have to keep that in mind for our errata. So first, Slicha Corner. At our last pod, we talked about two Jewish tennis players who we knew about at the Australian Open, and guys we've talked about a lot in the past, Denis Shapovalov and Diego Schwartzman, who are primed for a face-off in the third round in their bracket. Neither of whom made it there because they both lost in the third round. But who did Diego Schwartzman lose to? A qualifier and heretofore unknown player named Aslan Karatsev, who it turns out is Jewish. Nobody knew about this guy.
He is Iranian. He is Jewish. He is from the Caucasus. He is Russian. He's a real mosaic of what it takes to be a Jewish athlete in 2021.
Yeah. So this guy came out of nowhere. Aslan Karatsev was, I think, born in Russia or Ossetia, and moved to Israel, but then moved back to Russia and is a Russian. Plays under the Russian flag, and he had the best Grand Slam record for anyone who is qualifying in their first Grand Slam. So if anyone who made their rookie debut,
remarkable.
A rookie debut in a Grand Slam, he made it all the way to the semifinals. He ended up losing to Djokovic, which happens when you face Djokovic. But he made it all the way to the semifinals. He took down Schwartzman, as we said, who is a top 10 player. He took down Montrealer Felix Auger-Aliassime, who's a top 20 player. Dimitrov, his country, Romanian, I think, who's also a top 20 player. He had an amazing run. And this is a guy, he's 27 years old or 28 years old. He's like a virtual nobody. His highest ranking prior to the Australian Open was like in the 200s. And I think his ranking going into the Australian was like 400 or something like that. And he's Jewish. So good to know.
It's remarkable. He's fluent in Hebrew.
Yeah.
As well as Russian and English. His Wikipedia page, which obviously we read, lists his Hebrew name. And it's very interesting to see, it's rare a Jewish athlete, slips our grasp, but when they do, it's because they appear out of nowhere, like this guy.
Well, that was some of the reporting on it afterwards seemed to be a little bit of head scratching from the from Israeli tennis watchers saying like, how do we miss this guy? Like, how do we not develop him? How did he? How is he allowed to sort of move back to Russia and train there? Because there's some national
They'd like
esteem.
him to play as an Israeli.
Exactly.
As the same way they wanted Shapovalov to play as an Israeli.
Sure, but I'm saying you play in the place where you trained and with the people you trained with and all that. So it's just sort of sad that he could have been the first great Israeli tennis player or first one in a long time. And, he is still Israeli. I mean, Shapovalov's Israeli as well in terms of his nationality, but he doesn't play under that flag. So
it's true.
We'll see what happens. We'll see what happens to this guy. I mean, it's sort of like a Cinderella story. Who the hell knows if he? I'm not sure exactly how tennis qualifying works. If he gets a free pass to the other Grand Slams this year.
What I think now that he's in the top 64 in the world.
Okay, is he?
He gets to join the higher rank of the tour. Like he no longer has to qualify for so many tournaments.
And you get so many points.
The points.
Right. You get so many points from being in the semifinals of a Grand Slam that you make it that far. Because like in golf, for example, like I know like if you win a PGA tournament, usually you get to come to all the majors for the next year kind of thing.
Yeah. It gives you enough money. I think it actually is on the PGA Tour. It's organized by prize money won.
Okay.
But in tennis is organized, every tournament is points, and if you miss the tournament, you lose the points in the following year.
Okay.
Which is how Tiger Woods is able to keep his ranking, even though he only plays 10 or so tournaments a year, because he still wins enough total money to keep himself up high.
Right. I think at our next pod, we'll probably do a little bit of a preview on the upcoming baseball season, but maybe we should check in a little bit on basketball and hockey. Those seasons are not quite halfway, but getting there, getting to the sort of turn of the year. How are any Jewish hockey players we should be thinking about or talking about who are having a good season?
Absolutely. I'm sort of in the spotlight. Last year was first overall pick Jack Hughes with his very sort of French Dreyfus affair name, as Jamie pointed out last year. Jamie, can we get one from you here?
Jack Hughes.
Exactly, from the Jack Hughes. But his brother Quinn is the lead defenseman on the very, very poorly performing Vancouver Canucks, which leads him sort of exposed to a lot of high goal scoring. He, at the time of recording, he was leading the league in goals scored against him when he was on the. No, it was not good.
Is that Corsi? Is that Corsi? How's his Corsi?
I think his Corsi is probably relatively bad.
Oh, that's too bad. What about hometown hero Zach Hyman?
Left in the NHL, or left now currently NHL, hometown hero Zach Hyman is currently playing excellently for the Toronto Maple Leafs. He is playing, having a very, very good season. The Leafs are the single best team in the NHL, which is exciting to all of us who are in Toronto. As well,
pretty ironic it's happening in a year when no one can watch the games in person, eh?
I'm a little upset about that. I'm not so worried about that. I'm worried if the Leafs happen to win the Stanley Cup.
It's going to be a public health disaster.
Yeah, that's going to be a real public health disaster. Absolutely. Joshua Ho-Sang is playing in Sweden. He was cut again from the New York Islanders and let go. Friend of the podcast and former guest, Nate Thompson, is off to a good start, sort of bringing a veteran presence to the Winnipeg Jets.
Wow.
So the Canadian Jewish news from the Winnipeg, with another Canadian city with a very large Jewish community. Knowing how much he loves Chesky's Bakery in Montreal, we are only hoping he could find an equally good Jewish bakery. If you, for our listeners, we recommend you tweet at us and at Nate Thompson, telling him what Jewish bakery in Montreal to go to.
You mean Winnipeg?
In Winnipeg, I apologize, in Winnipeg to go to, so we can get into the Winnipeg Jewish community. But if we are focused on Zach Hyman, the Maple Leaf, he is off to a great start. Not always the highest point scorer, but he brings an element of grit, of toughness, of sort of a Maccabean style of play.
I like it.
They thought he would only last one shift in the NHL, but he lasted 8.
That's good.
And that's happened every game ever since.
Not much to update in terms of basketball. I know we talked about Denny Avdija, really the only known Jewish basketball player in the NBA at the moment. He's still having a not great rookie season, but a lot to build on. 5 rebounds a game, 5 rebounds a game, 6 points a game. Lot to build on there for a pretty moribund Washington Wizards team. Moving on from there, Gabe, we're lucky to be joined this episode by Eric Nusbaum, who recently wrote a book called Stealing Home.
That's correct. Eric was a lifelong Angelino. That is the term for someone who is from Los Angeles. I did not make it up, I promise. He is a lifelong Angelino who has recently left the city. However, before he did, he was working on a book telling the story of the process that went into building Dodger Stadium. The book is called Stealing Home because it sort of focuses on the stories of the people who lived in the land of Chavez Ravine before it was made into Dodger Stadium, the promise of the public housing complex that was to be developed there before the stadium, and sort of the process that led into the sale of the land and the building of the stadium. The book is about to come out in paperback later this month and will be available anywhere you buy your books. And it was very nice that Eric could join us for this conversation. Eric has had a long career writing in a lot of notable sports publications, from The Classical, where he was an editor, to formerly of Deadspin and now of Defector.com. He is currently freelancing for there too, as well as writing plenty of very interesting stories all over the internet for us to find. He also currently has a Substack newsletter about sports, which we will link to in the show notes and online.
Great. Let's go to our interview with Eric Nusbaum.
So welcome to the podcast. So what can you tell us about your new book?
Well, right into it. My name is Eric. The book is called Stealing Home. It is about the events in LA that led to the construction of Dodger Stadium sort of over decades. It is a dramatic and historical true story that is less about baseball than you might think and more about immigration and civic politics and the tragedy of the American dream gone awry.
It's a great topic for our listeners. I mean, the book isn't strictly speaking about Jewish people or Judaism in any way, but it is sort of a story that affects a lot of the Jewish American experience and touches on in that same sort of a lot about the 20th century diaspora and how, marginalized communities can interact with sports in both positive and negative ways. As we know about, that's sort of the story of the book, but what can you tell us about yourself that might have led to you telling the story?
Sure. Your listeners should know that I'm Jewish. I think it's an important part of why I'm here.
You'd be the first one who wasn't.
That was implied by the Nussbaum.
You never know.
Could be
I could have changed my name
with 2 M's.
It's true. I grew up in LA, and I went to school in Culver City, California, which is like a little city kind of wrapped up inside of LA. And at Culver City High School, I had this great U.S. history teacher who brought in a guest speaker named Frank Wilkinson. And Frank had been a public housing official in LA who was blacklisted in the McCarthy era, in 1952 to be precise. And he came in to talk about how his life, his family's lives, everybody's lives, the whole thing was messed up for him in the 50s, because of anti-communist fear. But what I didn't realize until that day was that his whole story was wrapped up in the events that led to Dodger Stadium being built. He had been trying to build this public housing project, which was then nixed amidst this Red Scare conspiracy, and that led to Dodger Stadium being built on that spot. So I have my childhood, my life, like very directly led me to reading this book, because I got this amazing experience as a high school student of hearing from Frank, and as a young baseball fan, I guess as a person who also had kind of heard tales of displacement and like government and forces bigger than you messing up your family's lives in irredeemable ways. It really moved me, and it stuck with me for literally like 15 years before I published the book.
But I thought that was a very important part of the story. And, so much in sports, we always sort of know the history of the teams. And, if you're a Dodgers fan, you know that there was a Brooklyn Dodgers before there was an LA Dodgers. You know that the team moved to LA. But we don't always talk about the physical space that these teams take up and the impact that has on the community, or a city or the people who actually live there. And that was very fascinating about the book, that that not just that people are displaced or the effect it had, but what else could the space have been? The opportunity cost of building a stadium where you build it, the time that you build it, and what that means to the people who are there.
Yeah, it's a huge thing. I mean, like the circumstances in this case were so convoluted and insane, like you can't even like replicate them. But there were communities that lived there that were good, self-sustaining communities that had, lots of history and deep roots and had done nothing to deserve getting kicked out of their homes. And then there was this possibility of a public housing project, which, whatever your opinions about public housing, you can see how that is theoretically, a public good. And you go from uprooting these communities to supposedly building public housing, to not building public housing, to then selling a piece of land to a private businessman from out of town, Walter O'Malley, the owner of the Brooklyn Dodgers, to build a stadium. And like, obviously Dodger Stadium is a beautiful building. I love it. And it's an important building in LA, maybe the most important building, I would argue. But the cost is not just, limited to that area where Dodger Stadium is. The cost ripples throughout the community, and throughout the generations in the community, and the trauma of those events ripples forward to today too. It is a huge thing that happened in the 50s, and it's in many ways still happening.
That, now that you mention sort of the lasting effect, something I wanted to dig into. One thing I sort of learned from reading the book is that the people who were rehomed were disproportionately Latino, and it sort of put a effect on the city. But I don't think it's controversial to say, and I think it's a great thing, that the Dodgers have a very, very strongly Latino fan base as well, as a lot of LA does. And I'm curious to what degree is a story like this sort of a mainstream part of the Dodger fandom?
I wouldn't say it's a mainstream part of the Dodger fandom. It's a thing that some Dodger fans know about. Many Dodger fans have a general idea that maybe something happened. I don't think it's a universally known fact. And then I think when people do understand it, they misunderstand it. I think the story gets compressed in a lot of ways where, like, the real story in really simple terms is that, like, do-gooder public housing activists came in, kicked out families to build public housing, and then they were railroaded by real estate interests in the Red Scare, and then the land sat empty, and then the final families were forcibly evicted, and then the Dodgers came and built the stadium. So that's like the very complicated but short version of the complicated story. The version that I think many people understand or misunderstand is that the Dodgers came and kicked out 3,000 people. That didn't happen either. Many people prefer to just not think about it at all. It's like, well, that happened a long time ago. I like the Dodgers, which in my opinion is not the way to go about it, but I understand it because it's sports, it's your favorite team, it's baseball. You want to have a beer and a hot dog and just enjoy yourself.
Sure. I mean, none of us really wants to think about all the, the warts and all portrayal of all our teams or, the owners necessarily, and how they got their money is not always savory, the most savory stories, how the teams got the space that they're in, how they acquired certain players even sometimes has a more unsavory bent to it. But I think it's important to tell the sort of story of the truth behind it so that people can sort of, understand the history of it and appreciate the history of that. I mean, especially with baseball, which is the most, the longest played professional leagues, the most American of sports, there is this sort of constant attempt to rewrite the history that doesn't necessarily value the lives of the people who were affected by decisions that were made at the highest levels, over the last 150 years, honestly, when we're talking about baseball.
Yeah, I mean, with baseball, it's all wrapped up in like the mythology of the sport and going back to, and I write about this in the book actually, like get kind of deep into like the weeds of the creation myth of baseball and Abner Doubleday and how baseball's kind of always been bought and sold. Not baseball like a physical baseball or a baseball team, but like the concept of baseball. And that was a big part of why LA really wanted a team, because the city kind of leaders had bought into this vision that baseball was this necessary American thing that would kind of lend credibility to the city and make LA a real American capital, as opposed to just this giant city on the West Coast that nobody took seriously.
Well, that's a really interesting point you bring up. I think the myth of baseball has been historically very effective at creating and motivating political will. As you just mentioned, it's something LA felt it needed to do to become that alpha city. But it comes to mind in times, tax breaks for stadiums and public dollars that go to sports team funding, about how sort of political will, when it comes to sports, in a lot of cases, just another example of something that takes over community need.
Yeah, I mean, it doesn't just happen in baseball either. Look at football or basketball or hockey. I mean, generally speaking, like sports teams tend to hold cities hostage and win. And
Absolutely.
That's sort of an ongoing tragedy in America.
And that's why I think this story is important, because as we grapple, all of us continue to grapple with those issues, or not us necessarily, but civic officials and county officials in various places deal with these issues. The idea of both eminent domain and expropriation of land and, moving stadiums around, things like that, taking cities hostage, continues to be an issue. And public funding for sports stadiums continues to be, it hasn't happened in Canada where we are much in the last little while, but in the States, it's outrageous, the kind of things that are going on. I mean, not necessarily public funding, but the size and scope of the new LA football complex is sort of an example of that. That is just sort of like, I'd be interested to hear your opinion about that, because as someone who lives in LA or is from LA, it seems like it's totally changing the area around it.
Yeah, I mean, it is. It's massive. I don't really think it was necessary, considering there's already, multiple other football stadiums in LA. And it's totally changing the area. People are going to get kicked out of their homes, and, storefronts are going to get shuttered and reopened with different businesses. And it's the way things just go. It's not necessarily about like one way this happens. It's about the general sort of pattern of powerful people with money making decisions that ultimately impact the way less powerful people with less money live, and where and how they live.
I think it's tough as a sports fan, because you want your team to stay in your city. You want there to be a new stadium,
and you want downtown stadiums as well.
Absolutely. But you don't want necessarily public funds going towards these things, or people's, whole neighborhoods being picked up and moved like they did in Brooklyn when they built Barclays, to sort of accommodate these stadiums. I should mention Eric. Eric recently published a piece on defector.com about the history of the minor leagues. I really enjoyed that, Eric. I thought that was, also an interesting historic take about, the way these things developed, and also the way the West Coast had a sort of quasi major league in the Pacific Coast League. That's basically, the history is done away with by baseball now, because they've reorganized the way the minor league system works.
Thank you. Yeah, I published that like 3 hours ago. I'm impressed how on top of it you guys are.
Well, I am a lawyer member subscriber to defector.com.
Lawyer member is higher than mine, because I can't even comment on my own articles that I wrote.
I am a lawyer, but I didn't pay the $1,000 to be a lawyer level member. That was a little too steep for me. But I think I paid the $100 that allows me to comment.
I should upgrade.
But James brings up a great point. This is obviously a very important story to you. What are some of the other things you read about?
I like history. I mean, I like stuff that happened a long time ago. I read a newsletter every week called Sports Stories. It's illustrated by my friend Adam Villison. So every week we do usually like a profile of a historic athlete, an unsung athlete, or unsung event that happened in sports. It comes out every Tuesday. It's at sportstories.substack.com.
If any of them are Jewish, please let us know.
We have a Jewish one in the pipe. It hasn't come out yet. I don't know if we've actually published a Jewish athlete. Now I have to think about it. In any case,
If you want to check, we've become very good at fact checking who's a Jew and who's not a Jew.
isn't it kind of depressing that like a lot of like the Jewish sports narrative comes down to like, is Jock Peterson really Jewish?
Oh yeah,
Yes. And the answer is yes, he is.
I'm aware of that because of the way that the Jewish sports narrative goes.
Something that the head of the Israeli sports authority once said. Israel believes if it was good enough for Hitler, it was good enough for them. And that's how I also feel about which athletes are Jewish.
I tend to be like, if you identify as Jewish, you're Jewish.
and even if you don't, sometimes we'll identify you for you.
Paul Goldschmidt, for example, total Baptist Christian, but all of his grandparents were Jews.
We've sort of taken a
I know.
I didn't know that about all four of Goldschmidt's grandparents were
I
Jews?
believe
Wow.
so.
I think half Jewish.
Have you gotten him on the show?
No.
His Goldschmidt or his grandparents.
Any or all of the above?
I think we've taken the position that our definition is some Jewish lineage is the basis point, but if someone rejects it, like the golfer Corey Pavin, like he converted to he's evangelical, that it's like if you convert away, okay, fine, we're not going to still claim you. But I think it's sort of like until we hear otherwise, if we find out that you're born Jewish, then you're Jewish for our purposes.
What about if you convert in, like Amari?
Oh, absolutely.
Yeah,
Amari is, if we ever get a basketball team together, he's the head coach.
David Beckham, too. He's playing point guard.
I didn't know. I feel like you could get Amari on the show. He's down to talk about his faith.
Oh, yeah. He's big time. Big time. We actually talked to Fred Katz of The Athletic last week. Episode went live yesterday, and there's a long chat about Amari's provenance.
Fred would be a better authority on this than I am.
Amari is a great example. I mean, we could talk about this all day and who's Jewish and who isn't, but there's many more people than you would expect. Soccer player Mario Balotelli was adopted by a Jewish family in Italy, was raised Jewish, even though he very much is not, biologically speaking.
If they're Jewish, Steph Curry has a shalom tattoo on his arm. Not Jewish per se, but we'll take that. So we'll. We are a small and growing sect of Jewish athletes and Jewish pro athletes especially. So we got to cast a wide net.
Do you identify as part of the sect of Jewish pro athletes?
No, but as someone who talks about Jewish pro athletes.
How about part of the orbit of Jewish
Part of the
pro
orbit,
athletes?
yeah.
That's
I have
fair.
talked to a Jewish pro athlete at least.
I was going to say, this brings us into our great question, great topic, and something that is definitely true of Los Angeles in a lot of ways is that, Los Angeles and New York tend to have interesting sort of cultural and immigrant and diasporic relationships to their sports teams. And, we sort of got to this earlier talking about the Dodgers and sort of the history of displacement they had in a majority Latino community that was solidly middle class, as you mentioned. It's interesting to know sort of how do you feel about, how teams, I would say groups or fans can sort of have that relationship that is part of your cultural identity as well as your local identity.
So I guess being a Jewish Dodger fan is liking Sandy Koufax. I think that's
Definitely.
where we're going in this conversation. He is universally liked, though. I think he's transcended just our small 2% of the population. But yeah, like being, I don't know, growing up as a Dodger fan in LA, like my dad also grew up in LA as a Dodger fan. And like he would tell me that like the time he saw Sandy Koufax at Yom Kippur was like the coolest thing ever to happen to him.
That does sound pretty cool.
It's a like maybe not the coolest thing, but it was memorable. It's a part of it. Like it's being a sports fan is a tribal thing. Like for me, I would say that like my relationship to the Dodgers is not that different from my attachment to Judaism, in that a lot of it is wrapped up in people I care about and my relationships, and it involves a lot of like heartache and deep scholarly examination of my values. Although ultimately I spend much more time thinking about those things in the context of the Dodgers than I do in my religion, if we're going to be honest. I spend a lot more time at baseball games than at Temple too.
That's a really common answer. And I mean, what do you think it is about the American experience that turns sports into a religion?
Well, I think part of it is the tribal aspect. Like, it's really like something that we do together. You sit up together, you sit down together, you yell and sing together. Like, there's actual physical similarities to the experience of, being in services or being at shul or whatever it is, or being at church and being at a game.
I had never thought of the standing up and sitting down together. That's a good point.
There's literally like a scoreboard telling you please rise and whatever. Like taking it to the ball game is like the Kaddish of the baseball game or whatever.
Please rise for Jock Peterson and then the Amida.
Exactly. There's just a lot similar to it. It's also regional, and religion is very much like you separate yourself into a group, and cities do that too. Like I have LA pride and West Coast pride, and like I'm going to get caught up in some petty bullshit with New York people. Absolutely I will. And I hope that they will too. Like that's kind of human nature, I think. I'm not sure.
I think it is too. Where do you live now?
I live in Tacoma, Washington now.
Tacoma, Washington.
Yes, sir.
Beautiful place.
It is.
I've been
I
once.
love it. Been here like a little over a year.
Are there any local sports teams you're following now in Tacoma?
Well, I was very excited to get into Tacoma Rainiers baseball, AAA team, which thankfully still exists.
That's the Mariners AAA team.
That's the Mariners AAA team. But we have not been able to go to a game since we moved here because of the pandemic.
We don't need to take up any more of your time, Eric. Thank you very much. This was great. Stealing Home is available anywhere you buy books, presumably?
Anywhere you buy books, yeah. Go to your local bookstore if you can.
Listeners, you can read Eric's work at defector.com. We'll post a link on our Twitter page to the recent article you wrote about minor league baseball. Informative for everybody about the reorganization going on there. Eric, anything else you want to plug before we take off?
Book's coming out in paperback in March 16th. Check it out. Check out Sports Stories newsletter, sportstories.substack.com. And thank you so much for listening.
It would make for great Passover reading.
It would. Honestly, Stealing Home would too. There's an actual exodus involved in the book. So like you'll find that out if you buy it.
There's the tie-in right there.
Well, thanks again, Eric. And let's be in touch.
Yeah, absolutely. Thank you guys.
Thanks, Eric. That was a great interview. Great chat with Eric. It was great to have him. He's welcome back anytime on our little program, especially if he is here to talk about Los Angeles sports, or if he can find any Jewish players that are playing in his new hometown of Tacoma on that minor league baseball team he is excited to follow. We would love if he wants to correspond for us.
Absolutely. Nice being an LA fan right now. I mean, two champions, the Lakers and the Dodgers in 1 year. I mean, we've all we've had is the Raptors win, which I'm not complaining about. It was pretty great, but
do you think that's what killed Larry King?
Oof. No, I think you think he just was so excited about it. He's like, now I can go.
Yeah, the Dodgers finally won, and then the Lakers won, and he was sitting. He sort of was always sitting there in that like weird hunched position with the two hands up, like a guy watching a movie theater in the first row. And now the Dodgers won, and he went, all right, that's enough.
Could be. It could have been the fact that he was like 90 something.
Yeah,
there's a time.
The global pandemic will come for us all, but
yeah,
thankfully it came for him. After the Mookie Betts trade.
I hope I live long enough to see the Blue Jays win a World Series. I'm sure I will. I'm sure they'll win.
I'm sure they will eventually.
That's like some bucket list stuff.
I actually wanted to ask you a question, regardless of the Dodgers, regardless of sports. Let's go for a non-sports division. Do you have a favorite Jew?
Ooh, do I have a favorite Jew aside from like my own personal family?
Yeah, outside your immediate orbit, let's say.
Yeah, I guess so. I mean, in terms of like people I admire or influence me, I'd say like Mordecai Richler is my favorite writer. He's one of my favorite Jews. Yeah. Do you have a favorite Jew?
I'm a big Liev Schreiber guy.
Ooh, cool.
I don't know if he's my favorite Jew, but he's cool. Exactly.
Yeah, he's cool.
He's cool.
He's a pretty kick-ass Jew.
Yeah, exactly. Like he's one of those guys that like an anti-Semite would be like, oh, like he's Jewish, damn. Like, he's one everyone wants.
Right.
But the reason I ask is we've actually got a new sister podcast.
Ooh.
During which comedian Laura Loeb, if I got that correctly, Laura Labo as my producer is telling me, Laura Lebo as my producer is telling me even fuller.
Oh man,
brings on who I believe to be non-Jewish people to ask who their favorite Jew is. It is a comedy podcast. Where hopefully they pronounce the names correctly, as well as discuss why they like Jews and who are their favorites. But
that's great.
Yeah, I'm surprised it's non-Jews. I'm not one to talk ill of. I love the CJN.
Yeah, it's a bit odd. I mean, it's like if I went on a podcast and someone's like, Jamie, who's your favorite Korean person? And
Yeah,
I explained like,
who is your favorite Korean person?
I don't know. I guess David Chang. I listen to his podcast sometimes.
Yeah, he's a pretty.
I enjoy his food.
Relatively notable. He's made some very, very good food. I don't know. I don't know if
it's probably actually maybe Huinjin Ryu actually.
Yeah,
but
he's the hefty lefty.
Anyways, the hefty lefty.
Yeah, he's great.
You can find these are a few of my favorite Jews at thecjn.ca or wherever you get your podcasts. At least until the estates of Rogers and Hammerstein come and sue our fledgling organization into the ground.
And, the first episode is up. Speaking of hefty lefties, it is about Jack Black.
That makes sense. That's someone who could be someone's favorite Jew.
I think he's a lot of people's favorite Jew. I think he's another one of those Jewish people who, like, you don't expect him to be Jewish, but once you find out, the pieces sort of start
happy
to fit.
Have him.
Yeah, happy to have him. Exactly. Welcome.
Absolutely.
Like
proud Jew, Jack Black.
Yeah, like as Adam Sandler when Tom Arnold converted to Judaism, he's one of those. Oh yeah, hell yeah, Tom Arnold. Come on, he's invited to the Seder.
Yeah, invited to the Seder. Anyways, let's leave it there for now. We'll be back in a few weeks to talk about baseball. Another great interview with interesting writers and Jewish sports people coming up soon. You can follow us on Twitter at the Menschwarmers. You can follow us on Facebook at the CJN Lounge or the CJN Podcast Network. Love to hear from you guys. Love the feedback and all that.
Absolutely.
And we'll see you guys again soon. Happy Purim.
Happy Purim, everyone.